as the finance director. Is that correct?
That's correct, Advocate.
We'll deal with that later on. Before we get there, in March 2015, you have the first task as a board. It relates to a matter introduced by Mr. Tsotsi, your then chairperson, relating to an inquiry to be conducted. Can you explain to the committee how does this get to the board? What is it that is brought to the board? How does the board deal with this issue and the role of the Minister of Public Enterprises?
Thank you, Advocate. Late on the evening, a request to attend a meeting on the morning of the 9th, and attached to the request was a list of about 9 resolutions. Difficulty with this because certainly the world of governance that I come from, we don't call meetings unless it's, it's critical to call them, like within a 12-hour period. That's the first thing. And secondly, I had previous engagements, so I couldn't make it. But the meeting continued because some members were available. And apparently at the meeting, the members felt that the matters that required the resolution on, matters like, that there must be an inquiry, that the inquiry must be for 3 months, that, we need to look at people who may be implicated. It was really, it actually crafted, it was really, I felt it prescribed how the board needed to proceed. But because I didn't attend the meeting, I had to rely on the minutes of that particular meeting so that I could follow what had happened. Apparently, at the meeting itself, according to the minutes, because of the gravity of the matters that the chairperson wanted the resolutions taken on, the view was that, we can't unilaterally make this decision. We want an entire board here. That was the first thing. And secondly, the chairperson, I think at that meeting also raised the point that he got a call from the presidency. And the members felt, the president of South Africa doesn't deal with matters such as this. So it's best that if anybody's going to talk to us, the minister must come and explain to us if this is indeed coming from outside of the chairman himself. And it was for that reason that the meeting then was rescheduled for the 11th of March, where the minister was invited to attend.
Now, at the meeting of the 11th, it would appear that you attended that meeting. Is that correct? What transpires at the meeting?
Firstly, we started off with the board meeting, with a normal board meeting, because the minister was going to be arriving a bit later. So, you see, I listed for you there the kind of issues that the ex or the then CEO, he took us through the fact that he was worried about the rotation of people losing skill and the engagement of labor. He gave us all of the issues that were top of mind for him. That happened in the board meeting prior to the minister's arrival. Minister then joined us for an in-committee meeting, and the board put it to the minister that we were concerned that we were being given a list of directives or basically instructions from the chairman on how to handle various things. I remember the minister giving us what to me were the same 4 things. She did not say that's not what you're supposed to do. She didn't say you will do that. She said what I've asked this board to do is to get their hands around the 4 issues like I explained, the load shedding being one, going concern being another, the fact that I cannot trust any information that I get from you, from Eskom, and the fact that the war room is running the operation. This board has got to grapple with that and come to terms with how to run this organization. She left by saying, I cannot tell you guys what you have to do about it, but I expect some level of traction around the issues that I've asked you, that I've raised. And she left. So it was a very short meeting. I think it was about 30 minutes or so.
You back to your in-committee meeting after the ministers left. You had missed the meeting on the 9th, and you've had to rely on the minutes. But my understanding is Mr. Tsotsi reintroduces the subject matter that he had introduced on the 9th. In your presence, what is it that Mr. Tsotsi is introducing to the board, and what are his motivations for the resolutions he is proposing?
Mr. Tsotsi again brings out the 9-point resolution, which is that an inquiry has got to be done, that it's got to take no more than 3 months, that anybody who's going to, according to him, slow down the inquiry must be asked to step aside in this time, that we've got to look at contracts. There were about 9 things that, and I've got it, I can let the committee have that, the 9 things. I must say, you know, my resolve, or probably the fight in me on the Sunday night to say, look, you know, we can't get prescribed to. You're sitting there and you've got all of these things coming at you. Load shedding is not getting solved, and that's, I go on to say that later. Every interaction with the executive at the time was how the matters were getting worse, not how they were getting better. And you got a minister literally saying to you guys, get a grip, get your hands around this. I'm expecting to see some changes here. And I cannot talk for anybody else, I can only talk for myself. At the time, knowing as well that the biggest issue was that, all information, or most information, coming out of Eskom, going to the war room, and there was lots of noise in the media. There just seemed to be so many versions of the truth. I think at that stage, I felt maybe it's not a bad idea to get a line in the sand and start understanding what actually are the biggest issues that we are facing here. So I think I wouldn't say rolled over and play dead, but at that stage, I conceded it may not be a bad idea to get a line in the sand so that I started to see the issues that's got to be addressed so that we can make that 3-year tenure of the board meaningful and at least try to correct some of what then was wrong.
Messeries Machela Koko, then Marokane, and the then Group Chief Executive, Tsidi Somatona, and Miss Sulufelo Molife get to be put on suspension. Why?
I'm a board member for 2 months. We're asked to get to grips with what's going on. The board at that particular meeting expressed concern, because you would see in my statement prior to the minister's arrival that one of the biggest things that the then CEO was concerned about was the exits of senior officials through resignations and retirements. He was worried about that. So the board didn't unilaterally just say, look, these are the 4 people, they must go. In fact, if anything, the board asked, could we not just do some form of a fact-finding, quick and dirty, so that one could determine, you know, who are the people that would possibly hold us back. I must say the then chairman of the board was adamant that the 4 people would slow us down. And when pushed to say, but you know, what do you mean by that? He said, look, he gave us examples. He said that the then CFO had been involved or met with some people who were tendering for some tender on the table, and he felt that that was why it's best that she stepped aside, because it was, I suppose if you look at it now, maybe an integrity issue. That's what we were told. Okay. The second person that he had something to say about was Michela Koko, where there was some discussion of misconduct with a staff member, and he, for that reason, so he actually motivated why these were the 4 members of staff. And I remember the only CA on the board was Mark Pomensky. And I remember at the meeting, Mark saying, but you know, we can't take CFO out of here. I mean, you can't do that. And we were really struggling. How do we do that? And various other board members were concerned. But at the end of the day, I think Zola Tsotsi was strong enough to convince us that if we wanted to get this done and done expeditiously, that would be the best way to do it.
Let's look at the FD's role and its significance to the loans or the bond relating to Eskom. Let's look at the significance of the Group Chief Executive. What message, or rather let me put it this way, did you ever consider the impact of that decision on the markets and how they would pursue Eskom?
Like I said, we definitely did look at it. But I think nothing could have prepared this new board for what happened in the media with the suspensions. You'll remember that was when we had our first downgrade, and it was called a downgrade based on governance, and it was particularly around the matters that you've just raised. But being between a rock and a hard place, sitting there and you're told you've got to get your hands around this animal, which didn't seem like it was being properly managed at the time. I mean, I commented on that. Every meeting and interaction that I had just felt like the glass was half empty. There were no answers. We just needed more money for diesel and more money for diesel, and this was all outside of budgets, and we didn't have answers. And I think that is what eventually certainly convinced me we needed something different. And that is when, for me, the decision to support, in spite of wanting to have done the fact-finding first, took over.
Do I get your testimony to be confirming that your decision contributed to the downgrade of Eskom's rating?
Advocate Venara, I think it is common knowledge. It was all over the press at the time that that was the reason for the downgrade. The suspensions at the time, as you say, when your people were out there trying to raise funds. And that was the first time that we got their downgrade, which was around about, I think it was about April of 2015.
I seem to be getting a picture, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you were kind of put under pressure to consider these suspensions, which is why you eventually acceded, notwithstanding some of your reservations. Is that a fair reflection?
That's definitely right, sir.
Now that the 4 are gone, and there are, of course, financial implications, there is an investigation to be conducted. Who must conduct this investigation?
One of the resolutions that Mr. Tsotsi had for us to consider and agree to was that the investigation the original document said that it would be run by himself, and audit and risk was being run by Ms. Tswaita Mabude. In the later documents, it was that audit and risk, with the support of people in governance, must take control of the investigation itself.
Is it Nick Linnell? What do you know about him regarding the investigation that was meant to have taken place?
Mr. Zola Tsotsi alluded to the fact that a lot of work had already been done on Eskom and brought in Nick Linnell as a consultant who would work together with audit and risk in setting up the terms of reference, and then working with whoever the service provider would be. The board was very, very unhappy with this. The board felt that it felt like it had been pre-planned. There'd been work that had been brought onto the table that this board had no knowledge of. We were not involved with securing the services of Nick Linnell or anybody else. And it was at that stage that the board started losing confidence in Mr. Tsotsi. I just want to, if I may, Advocate, just take you back to paragraph 34. On a personal level, what really worried me at that stage was that when a decision needed to be made on who was going to act for the CFO, the CE, etc., Mr. Tsotsi put forward the name of a young man by the name of, I don't know if he's young, but anyway, a gentleman by the name of Malisela Sekasumbi to take over as acting CEO. Because remember, by now we'd suspended people. We now needed people to fill the roles. I think what was really, for me, a very bitter pill to swallow was when I learned that Malisela Sekasumbi was actually on suspension for some or other matter. And the chairman chose not to tell us that Malisela was on suspension, but offered up this gentleman's name to become the acting CEO. I think what for me was a little difficult, however, was that when I went to the minutes after I spoke to you, Advocate, to prove that point, that the chairman had given us the name of somebody who was actually on suspension to come in and act as the CEO, I found that the minute which had been signed off actually said the opposite of that. It said that this board had wanted to bring Malisela Sekasumbi to be the to be the acting CEO, and that he, Zola Tsotsi, had to stop that because the guy was on suspension. Now, fortunately for me though, I do keep a lot of records, and I've managed to track down the letter that we eventually issued against Mr. Tsotsi as to why the board lost confidence in him, and this is in that letter. So even though the minutes said that Mr. Tsotsi, had to correct the board and say the guy is on suspension, the letter clearly says that Mr. Zola Tsotsi wanted to bring somebody from suspension to come and run this company. So that was really, for me, in bad taste, and I lost complete confidence.
Now, you're painting a picture of a distortion of the minutes. It will be interesting then to understand how do board minutes at Eskom during your tenure get to be approved and confirmed by those decision makers so that instances of this nature are eliminated?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Advocate Venora. Let's just say that when I arrived at, for example, Social Ethics and Sustainability, where I then became the chairman right from the beginning, from about January, February, my very first meeting, they wanted me to sign off minutes for the whole of 2014, and I refused. So I don't think that minute taking was ever top of mind. And I mean, in any event, if you sign off a minute a year later, you cannot possibly remember what was in it. So I do believe that the minute that I'm referring to, which I am led to believe was signed off by Dr. Ben after Zola Tsotsi left, was probably signed off in error, because that definitely was not what had happened at the meeting.
You talk about a letter that will confirm your assertions. What is this letter? From whom is it, and to whom is it addressed?
It's a letter from Thomson Wilkes, who are the lawyers who the board had appointed to assist with the charging of Mr. Zola Tsotsi. And one of the charges was this matter of Malisela Sekasumbi, who was on suspension, that he wanted to bring back in the role of acting chair. The second matter was the day after the 19th, the 20th of March, Mr. Zola Tsotsi released a media statement about the inquiry with a whole lot of detail that had never come past this board. And the board just felt that he was bringing it into disrepute and disregarding the role of the board. The third charge against Mr. Tsotsi at the time was the appointment of Nick Linnell, which had not come past the board. This board had no input. Nick Linnell was imposed on us. And those were the three things that we charged Mr. Tsotsi on.
And what happened to these charges?
We had various meetings with Mr. Tsotsi and his legal advisors, and after a couple of those meetings, Mr. Tsotsi agreed to leave Eskom as a director and as chairman of the board.
Mr. Tsotsi doesn't leave long after the suspensions of these 4 executives. He seems to have played a critical role in persuading, if not going to an extent of exerting some form of pressure on you, to agree to the suspensions. He's now gone. There is an investigation. Now, if there are suspicions that he had brought forward which were the basis of the suspensions, one assumes that the investigation then gets to deal with these allegations. It might not be the inquiry itself, it might be a completely different investigation. The cause for the suspension of these officials, does it get to be investigated? If so, by whom? If it was investigated, what was the outcome of that investigation?
The motivations that we received for why people had to be suspended was exactly that, the motivations. They were motivations to get the board to concede to do the inquiry. Remember, none of the executives were ever charged. And as I shared with you, I got a clean bill of health on the last, we'll talk about that later, the one member who then was brought back. But none of the board members or none of the executives, like I said, the story with the CFO having met with somebody, a potential person who was involved with some tender, that wasn't, we didn't get the details on it. That was only used to encourage us to get the suspensions through, to my mind. And then the allegations about, you know, something irregular with the fellow staff member, that apparently was an ongoing thing that had happened in the organization some time back. It hadn't been current. It was just the kinds of stuff he was trying to put to us, that we've got to get these people out of the way so that these things can happen and happen quickly.
So the long and the short of it is those 4 officials were suspended for no legitimate reason.
At the time, the legitimacy was impressed upon us in terms of getting it done and getting it done quickly. And I think what gave me comfort was the fact that these guys were not being charged with anything. We were not charging them. They were not being told, look, you've done this and that's wrong, but they were told that they're not being charged, and it was all about getting this inquiry done in 3 months. That's what the driving force behind that inquiry was.
I understand, ma'am. Now we know, this is your testimony before this committee, that having all of that which Mr. Tsotsi and company had told you, as you sit there today, Is there any specific basis in law that you could say, this is why we had suspended these officials?
No, Advocate Venara, I can't, other than to say that as a board member appointed to a board for 3 years, with the days rolling down, and you're being told by people who'd been there before you that this is a way to deal with it and deal with it quickly, the matters was of such a nature that we believed something needed to get done. With the benefit of hindsight, the board did try to resist in doing a fact-finding mission before, not before the inquiry, but before the suspensions. And like I said, we were persuaded not to go that route.
And your decision has costed in Eskom a downgrade. And that decision would necessarily have costed a fruitless and wasteful expenditure. The top brass of EXCO, with all its expertise, was sitting idling at home when Eskom were calling for their services for no reason. Is that what you're telling the committee today?
I'm not sure that I follow what you're saying. Are you asking if our decision cost the downgrade? Is that the question?
I thought we'd done that. We're done with that. We're done with that. I'm asking you, your decision to suspend the top brass of EXCO, the group chief executive, the finance director, Dan Murakana, and Koko, those were the top brass of EXCO. Would you agree with that?
That's correct.
You're sitting there today, you say there was no reason in law for them to have been suspended. And I'm saying they were sitting idling at home during their suspension. Highly competent, highly qualified individuals being paid whilst sitting at home. The company is calling for their skills and competences for no reason. Is that what happened?
With the information that I had at my disposal at that time, sir, that is the decision that we made. And if it was a bad decision, it was based on the information that I had at hand at that time.